The easiest way to recognize someone who believes the rules only apply to other people is to watch what they do when they think your kindness belongs to them. I had barely pushed my grocery cart out of the supermarket when a teenage boy stepped directly in front of me, planted both feet on the pavement, and looked down at the bags filling my cart. The late afternoon sun reflected off the windshields in the crowded parking lot. Shopping carts rattled across the concrete, and people loaded groceries into pickup trucks and family SUVs without paying much attention to us. At first, I assumed he needed directions or wanted to return a loose shopping cart. Instead, he pointed at 2 paper bags near the top of my cart and said, "My mom said you can give us those." I blinked because I honestly thought he was joking. "Excuse me?" I asked with a smile that slowly disappeared when he repeated himself. "We need groceries too. My mom said you have plenty." There was no embarrassment in his voice, no hesitation. He sounded as though he were reminding me of an obligation I had somehow forgotten. "My name is Daniel Carter, and I have lived in Willow Creek for almost 6 years. Every Saturday afternoon, I stop by the same grocery store after finishing errands, buying enough food to prepare meals for the week ahead. Cooking has always helped me clear my mind after long workdays, and I enjoy taking my time choosing fresh vegetables, good steaks, homemade bread, and the ingredients for recipes my father taught me years ago. I usually wear blue jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and an old baseball cap when I am off duty because I prefer blending into everyday life instead of standing out. That afternoon was no different. I looked like any other middle-aged neighbor pushing a grocery cart toward an aging pickup truck parked a few rows away. Before I could answer the teenager again, I heard quick footsteps approaching across the parking lot. A woman wearing sunglasses, an expensive blazer, and the unmistakable expression of someone accustomed to getting her way stopped beside him. She never introduced herself. She never greeted me. She simply glanced at my cart before looking back at her son. "Those bags will be enough," she said confidently, as though discussing items she had already purchased. Then she turned to me and smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile that expected agreement rather than conversation. "We are neighbors," she said. "People in this community help each other. My son told you which groceries we need." For several seconds, I honestly wondered whether I had misunderstood the situation. Then I recognized her. Rebecca Lawson, president of our homeowners association. I had seen her at neighborhood meetings a handful of times, although she had probably never noticed me. I kept my voice calm and told her those groceries belonged to me and that I was heading home to put them away before dinner. Her pleasant smile disappeared almost instantly. Around us, a few shoppers slowed their pace, quietly sensing that something unusual was unfolding between the parked cars. What Rebecca did not realize was that the decision she was about to make would bring exactly the people she believed would support her, and before the evening ended, everyone in that parking lot would see the difference between real authority and simply acting like you have it. People often assume they can tell who you are by looking at what you wear, the vehicle you drive, or the groceries sitting in your shopping cart. I stopped making that mistake years ago, which is probably why I rarely judge strangers before learning their story. My weekends were intentionally simple because my job demanded enough responsibility during the rest of the week. Saturday afternoons meant grocery shopping, preparing meals for the next several days, mowing the lawn if it needed it, and spending a few quiet hours on the back patio with a book or a baseball game playing softly on the radio. It was a routine I protected because it reminded me there was still a difference between my professional responsibilities and my personal life. Off-duty, I preferred faded blue jeans, worn work boots, a flannel shirt, and an old pickup truck that had more miles than I cared to count. Most people who saw me assumed I worked with my hands or had just finished a home improvement project. I never corrected them because appearances were never important to me. My father had spent more than 30 years serving as a firefighter, and one lesson he repeated throughout my childhood stayed with me long after I grew up. He always said that the uniform represented responsibility, not superiority. The moment someone started believing the badge made them more important than everyone else, they had already forgotten why they earned it in the first place. That lesson shaped every decision I made throughout my career, and it was the reason I never mentioned my position unless the situation genuinely required it. By the time I met Rebecca Lawson in that grocery store parking lot, she knew nothing about me beyond the fact that I lived somewhere in the neighborhood. We had crossed paths during a few homeowners association meetings over the years, but I usually sat quietly in the back, listened to updates, voted when necessary, and and went home. I had never introduced myself by my profession, and nobody had ever asked. That anonymity suited me just fine. Looking back, I realized it probably contributed to what happened next, because Rebecca clearly believed she understood exactly who she was dealing with. As she stood beside her son, she looked from my grocery cart to my pickup truck and then back to my face with the confident expression of someone making a decision rather than asking a question. She repeated that neighbors should help one another and explained that her family needed several items more than I did. I politely answered that I understood everyone faced challenges from time to time, but these groceries were already purchased for my household, and I was not comfortable giving them away to someone I barely knew in the middle of a parking lot. My voice remained calm, and I kept both hands resting on the shopping cart handle. There was no argument, no raised voices, and no hostility. Even so, her expression changed almost immediately. The friendly tone disappeared, replaced by visible irritation. Her son folded his arms and looked at me as though I had broken an unwritten neighborhood rule. Around us, more shoppers began slowing down while loading groceries into their vehicles, quietly sensing that an ordinary Saturday afternoon was about to become something none of us had expected. Rebecca took one slow step closer to my shopping cart and glanced down at the paper grocery bags as though she were reviewing inventory instead of someone else's property. Her son immediately reached toward the handle of one bag containing fresh vegetables, bread, and a package of chicken I planned to cook later that evening. I gently moved the cart backward a few inches before his hand reached it and calmly said, "Please do not touch my groceries." My voice never changed. I did not sound angry. I simply stated the obvious boundary that most people would never think needed to be explained. The teenager looked back at his mother, clearly waiting for instructions. Rebecca sighed dramatically, folded her sunglasses onto the top of her head, and spoke loudly enough that nearby shoppers could hear every word. "This is exactly what is wrong with people today," she announced. "Nobody wants to help their neighbors anymore." Several people loading groceries into nearby vehicles looked toward us with curious expressions, trying to understand what had happened. Rebecca pointed toward my cart again and explained that her family had forgotten several items and that any reasonable neighbor would gladly share a few grocery bags instead of acting selfishly. She carefully avoided mentioning that she had never actually asked. She spoke as though the decision had already been made before I ever arrived in the parking lot. I quietly replied that I believed helping neighbors was important, but kindness was something people offered freely, not something another person could demand. For a brief moment, I thought the conversation might finally end. Instead, her son crossed his arms and said that everyone in the neighborhood knew his mother always got things done. Rebecca smiled proudly at the comment before looking directly at me again. "You must be new here," she said confidently. "People cooperate with the Homeowners Association." I simply answered that I had lived in the neighborhood for several years and wished them both a pleasant afternoon before placing another grocery bag into the bed of my pickup truck. That was apparently the wrong answer. Rebecca's expression hardened almost instantly. She stepped closer, keeping several feet between us, and announced that refusing to support a neighbor reflected poorly on the community. Then she claimed my behavior was creating a public disturbance because people had stopped walking through the parking lot to watch the conversation. The irony almost made me smile because every person standing nearby had arrived only after she began speaking loudly enough for half the parking lot to hear. A young couple paused beside their SUV while quietly observing from a respectful distance. An elderly man returning a shopping cart shook his head slightly, but continued walking. Another shopper casually raised a phone, apparently recording the unusual exchange without saying a word. Through it all, I remained beside my truck, calmly loading groceries one bag at a time while answering only when necessary. The more patient I became, the more frustrated Rebecca appeared. Finally, she pulled her phone from her purse, tapped the screen several times, and looked directly at me with complete confidence. "If you are going to behave this way," she said, "we will let the police sort this out." I nodded politely and closed the tailgate of my pickup. "That is entirely your decision," I replied. What Rebecca did not realize was that the next few minutes would test far more than her assumptions about me. They would reveal exactly how quickly confidence falls apart when it is forced to stand beside the truth. Rebecca held her phone at shoulder height with the confidence of someone who believed the next few minutes would end exactly the way she expected. She spoke loudly enough for nearly everyone within 20 feet to hear every word as she described an uncooperative man causing problems in the supermarket parking lot and refusing to support a neighbor in need. I listened quietly without interrupting because correcting someone in the middle of an emotional conversation rarely changes anything. Facts usually carry more weight after everyone has finished talking. When she ended the call, she slipped the phone back into her purse with a satisfied smile and folded her arms. "They will be here shortly," she announced. "I hope you are prepared to explain yourself." I simply nodded and continued placing the final reusable shopping bags neatly inside the bed of my pickup truck. The warm afternoon breeze carried the smell of fresh bread from the bakery entrance, while shopping carts rattled across the pavement in every direction. Families continued coming and going, but more than a few people lingered nearby after loading their own groceries, quietly curious about how such an ordinary shopping trip had turned into a public disagreement. Rebecca interpreted their attention as support. She smiled politely at several onlookers and explained that the Homeowners Association worked hard to maintain standards within the community and that cooperation was important. She never mentioned that this conversation had started because her son expected a stranger to surrender groceries that had already been purchased. Instead, she described the situation as though she were defending neighborhood values against unnecessary selfishness. Her son stood beside her with folded arms, occasionally glancing toward my pickup truck before looking back at his mother for reassurance. I remained beside the tailgate, resting one hand lightly against the closed truck bed while waiting. Waiting had become a valuable habit throughout my career because impatience often created mistakes that could never be taken back. Every situation deserved the opportunity to unfold before anyone rushed toward conclusions. Several shoppers quietly exchanged puzzled looks. One elderly woman approached just far enough to ask whether everything was all right. I smiled and assured her that the situation would be resolved shortly. She nodded kindly and continued toward her vehicle. A young father pushing a shopping cart with two children slowed briefly before moving on, clearly deciding the disagreement was none of his business. Meanwhile, another customer continued recording from a respectful distance without interfering. Rebecca noticed the phone and seemed almost encouraged by the growing audience. "People need to see this," she said confidently. "Communities only work when everyone follows the rules." I found the statement interesting because nothing about this situation involved any homeowners association rule. We were standing in the parking lot of a grocery store several miles from our neighborhood discussing food that had already been paid for. Even so, I resisted the temptation to point that out. There would be plenty of time for facts once the responding officers arrived. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of a patrol vehicle approaching through afternoon traffic. Rebecca straightened her blazer and lifted her chin with visible satisfaction. Her son smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Neither of them noticed that my expression never changed. I had no intention of introducing myself before anyone else had the opportunity to do their job. Sometimes the clearest picture of a situation appears only after everyone believes they already understand it. The patrol vehicle rolled slowly into the parking lot with its emergency lights off, signaling that the responding officers had arrived to assess the situation rather than react to an immediate danger. The familiar engine sound blended into the background noise of shopping carts and passing traffic, but it immediately changed the atmosphere around us. Conversations grew quieter. Several people who had been pretending not to watch suddenly found reasons to remain nearby. Rebecca smiled with unmistakable confidence and took 2 steps forward before the patrol car had even come to a complete stop. She waved enthusiastically, eager to tell her version of the story first. Her son stood beside her with the same expression, convinced that help had finally arrived on their side. I stayed exactly where I was, one hand resting lightly against the closed tailgate of my pickup truck, allowing the officers to approach without interruption. They stepped out calmly, scanning the area the way experienced officers always do before speaking. One looked briefly at Rebecca while the other glanced toward me. Neither rushed to conclusions. They simply observed. Rebecca immediately began explaining that I had refused to cooperate with a neighbor, had created unnecessary conflict in the parking lot, and had behaved in a manner she considered disruptive to the community. She spoke quickly, leaving very little space for anyone else to add context. The officers listened politely without interrupting, occasionally nodding while taking in the details. When she finished, One officer thanked her and turned toward me. I noticed the moment his eyes focused on my face. There was no dramatic reaction, no exaggerated surprise, just the brief pause that comes when someone recognizes a familiar person in an unexpected place. His expression shifted from routine concentration to quiet recognition. He exchanged a quick glance with his partner before both walked the remaining distance toward me. Rebecca folded her arms with complete confidence, clearly expecting them to begin questioning me immediately. Instead, the senior officer stopped a respectful distance away and offered a professional smile. "Good afternoon, Chief Carter," he said evenly. "I did not expect to see you here today." I returned the smile with a simple nod. "Good afternoon, Officer Mitchell," I replied. "Looks like everyone has had an interesting afternoon." The second officer greeted me just as professionally before either of them asked another question. The parking lot became remarkably quiet. Even the people standing several yards away seemed to sense that something significant had just happened. Rebecca stared at all three of us without saying a word. The confidence that had filled her voice only moments earlier slowly faded into visible confusion. She looked from the officers to me and back again, searching for an explanation that fit the picture she had already built in her mind. I had never mentioned my profession because it was never relevant until that exact moment. The officers did not treat me differently because of my position. They simply recognized me the same way any coworkers would recognize one another outside the office. Officer Mitchell then turned back toward Rebecca with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the beginning and said, "Ma'am, let us hear the entire situation from everyone involved so we can understand exactly what happened." At that moment, the assumptions carrying the entire confrontation began giving way to something far more dependable than appearances: the facts. Officer Mitchell began exactly where every good investigation begins, with simple questions instead of assumptions. He asked Rebecca to explain what had happened from the beginning, and this time she spoke more carefully than before. She repeated that neighbors should help one another, that I had refused to cooperate, and that my attitude had attracted unwanted attention in the parking lot. She also mentioned that the Homeowners Association encouraged community support, as though that somehow gave her authority over a private purchase made at a grocery store several miles away from our neighborhood. When she finished, Officer Mitchell thanked her without agreeing or disagreeing with anything she had said. He then turned toward me and asked for my account. I explained the entire encounter exactly as it had happened. I described leaving the supermarket, being stopped by her son, hearing him tell me that his mother said I could give them several bags of groceries, and politely declining after Rebecca arrived, and repeated the demand herself. I made a point of keeping my explanation short, factual, and free of emotion because facts rarely need decoration. The second officer took notes while listening, occasionally asking a clarifying question about the order of events. Before either officer reached a conclusion, Officer Mitchell looked around the parking lot and asked whether anyone nearby had witnessed the conversation from the beginning. Almost immediately, the elderly woman who had checked on me earlier stepped forward. She calmly explained that she had heard the teenager tell me his mother expected me to hand over groceries before Rebecca ever walked over. A young couple also volunteered that they had watched most of the exchange while loading their vehicle. Their recollections closely matched mine. Then the shopper who had quietly recorded part of the encounter raised a hand and offered to show the officers the video captured on the phone. With permission, the officers viewed the recording together. Although it did not include every second of the conversation, it clearly showed Rebecca speaking confidently about taking groceries that had already been purchased and insisting that I should simply hand them over because we lived in the same community. When the video ended, neither officer appeared surprised. They simply thanked the individual for preserving the recording and returned the phone. Rebecca's confident posture slowly softened as she realized the situation was no longer built upon competing opinions. It was now supported by independent witnesses and documented evidence. Officer Mitchell spoke respectfully to everyone present. He explained that disagreements between neighbors should never involve demands for another person's property and that calling law enforcement was appropriate only when a genuine legal concern existed, not because someone refused an unreasonable request. His tone remained professional throughout the conversation. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches, and no special treatment. The same standards applied to everyone standing in that parking lot. Rebecca looked at me for several long seconds before quietly asking why I had never mentioned who I was. I answered honestly that my profession had nothing to do with buying groceries or being treated with basic respect. For the first time since the encounter began, she had no immediate response, and the silence that followed seemed far more meaningful than anything either of us could have said. The officers thanked each witness for taking the time to speak and made a few final notes before closing their notebooks. There was no dramatic ending, no argument, and no celebration. The tension that had filled the parking lot simply dissolved as the facts settled into place. One by one, the shoppers who had paused to watch returned to their own errands, but not before several of them offered me polite smiles or quiet nods as they walked past. I appreciated the gesture, although I would have been just as satisfied if everyone had simply gone home knowing the situation had been handled fairly. Officer Mitchell turned to Rebecca and spoke with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the moment he arrived. He explained that while neighbors were always encouraged to support one another voluntarily, no individual had the authority to pressure another person into surrendering private property. He also reminded her that disagreements over personal expectations should never be presented as matters requiring law enforcement unless an actual legal issue existed. Rebecca listened without interrupting. Her shoulders had relaxed noticeably, and the confidence she displayed earlier had been replaced by quiet reflection. Her son stood beside her without saying a word, keeping his eyes fixed on the pavement for several long moments. I could almost see him replaying everything that had happened since he first stepped in front of my shopping cart. After a brief silence, Rebecca looked toward me. The certainty that had filled her voice earlier was gone. She admitted that she had assumed I would simply agree because she believed neighbors owed one another that kind of generosity. I answered that generosity loses its meaning the moment it becomes an expectation instead of a choice. Real communities are built when people help because they want to, not because they feel pressured by someone's title or position. Officer Mitchell nodded slightly but remained silent, allowing the conversation to continue naturally. Rebecca took a slow breath before offering an apology. It was not polished or rehearsed. It sounded uncomfortable, which often makes an apology more genuine than one delivered perfectly. She acknowledged that she should have respected my answer the first time I declined and admitted that involving the police had only made a simple misunderstanding much more complicated than it ever needed to become. Her son quietly added that he should never have reached toward my groceries without permission. I accepted both apologies because holding on to resentment rarely improves anyone's future. I told the teenager that everyone makes mistakes, especially when they learn by watching adults around them, and that what mattered most was choosing differently the next time. He nodded, and for the first time since we met, his expression reflected embarrassment instead of entitlement. Before leaving, Officer Mitchell asked whether either of us needed any further assistance. We both answered no. The officers wished everyone a safe afternoon, returned to their patrol vehicle, and drove away as calmly as they had arrived. The parking lot quickly returned to its ordinary rhythm of shopping carts, families, and weekend errands. I finished securing the last grocery bag in my pickup truck and closed the tailgate. As I reached for the driver's door, Rebecca quietly said, "I judged you before I knew anything about you." I looked back and smiled politely. "The truth is," I replied, "you did not need to know anything about me to treat me with respect." Those words lingered in the afternoon ere long after the patrol car disappeared from view, and somehow they carried more weight than any job title ever could. The following Thursday evening, the monthly Homeowners Association meeting filled the clubhouse earlier than usual. Folding chairs disappeared quickly, neighbors stood along the walls, and quiet conversations echoed through the room before the meeting officially began. News travels fast in any neighborhood, especially when a public misunderstanding becomes the subject of weekend conversations. I arrived a few minutes early, signed my name on the attendance sheet, picked a seat near the back of the room, and waited without drawing attention to myself. I had no intention of speaking unless someone asked me a direct question. My goal had never been to embarrass anyone. I simply believed misunderstandings should be corrected with facts instead of assumptions. Rebecca entered several minutes later carrying a binder beneath one arm. Unlike previous meetings, she did not immediately begin greeting everyone with confident enthusiasm. Instead, she quietly organized her papers while members of the board settled into their seats. When the meeting reached the section reserved for community concerns, one homeowner politely raised a hand and mentioned the incident at the grocery store. No names were used at first, only a simple observation that several residents had heard conflicting stories and wanted reassurance that the homeowners association respected personal boundaries outside neighborhood business. The room became noticeably quieter. Rebecca stood slowly and addressed the members with a calm voice. She acknowledged that the incident had reflected poor judgment on her part and accepted responsibility for allowing a personal disagreement to become something much larger than it should have been. She clarified that the homeowners association had absolutely no authority over private purchases or personal decisions made away from neighborhood property and apologized for creating confusion by suggesting otherwise. Several board members thanked her for addressing the matter directly. One of them emphasized that community leadership depended upon trust, and that trust could only exist when expectations remained consistent with the association's actual responsibilities. Another board member proposed creating a brief written reminder explaining the limits of homeowners association authority so new residents would better understand the difference between neighborhood guidelines and individual personal rights. The suggestion received broad support throughout the room. A few neighbors shared stories about small misunderstandings that had been resolved through simple conversations rather than unnecessary conflict, and the discussion gradually shifted from assigning blame toward improving communication. I listened quietly, appreciating that the meeting had become productive instead of confrontational. Near the end of the discussion, Rebecca looked toward me and thanked me publicly for remaining respectful throughout the entire situation. She admitted that my patience had prevented an uncomfortable afternoon from becoming much worse, and said she hoped the neighborhood would learn from her mistake instead of repeating it. I nodded politely without making a speech. There was nothing left to prove because the important lesson had already reached everyone in the room. As neighbors gathered their belongings after the meeting, several people stopped to introduce themselves properly for the first time. We spoke about gardening, local restaurants, weekend projects, and ordinary life rather than the events at the grocery store. Walking back to my pickup beneath the soft glow of the parking lot lights, I realized the strongest communities are not built by people who demand respect through titles or positions. They are built by neighbors who understand that courtesy, humility, and fairness should be offered freely to every person long before anyone learns what they do for a living. Several months have passed since that Saturday afternoon, yet every time I push a grocery cart across the same parking lot, I find myself remembering how quickly assumptions can turn an ordinary day into an unforgettable lesson. In many ways, life in Willow Creek returned to exactly what it had always been. Children rode their bicycles through the neighborhood after school, families gathered in their front yards on warm evenings, and weekend lawn mowers created the familiar soundtrack that seemed to echo from one street to the next. My own routine never changed. Every Saturday, I still drove the same old pickup truck to the same grocery store, walked the same aisles, and bought enough food to prepare meals for the coming week. The only difference was that more people recognized me now, not because of my position, but because of what they had learned from watching how that afternoon had unfolded. Rebecca changed as well. Over the following months, she became noticeably more thoughtful during homeowners association meetings, asking for opinions before making decisions and encouraging respectful discussions instead of assuming she already had the right answer. Her son also seemed different. One afternoon, I ran into him at the local hardware store while he was helping an elderly neighbor load bags of garden soil into her vehicle. He smiled when he recognized me and waved before returning to help without expecting anything in return. That small moment told me more than any apology ever could. Real growth is measured by changed behavior, not carefully chosen words. The written reminder approved by the Homeowners Association eventually became part of every welcome packet given to new residents, clearly explaining what the association could and could not do while encouraging neighbors to resolve everyday disagreements through simple conversations whenever possible. It was a practical change, but sometimes practical changes have the greatest impact because they prevent future misunderstandings before they ever begin. Looking back, people occasionally ask whether I regret never introducing myself as the police chief at the beginning of that encounter. My answer has always been the same. If respect depends on revealing a title, then it is not really respect at all. Every stranger deserves courtesy before anyone knows their profession, income, education, or position in the community. A badge may represent responsibility, but it should never become the reason someone chooses basic decency. That lesson came from my father long before I earned my own badge, and after everything that happened, I believe it even more strongly today. The groceries we argued about were eaten within a week and long forgotten, but the lesson from that afternoon remained. Kindness has value only when it is freely given. Authority has value only when it is exercised with humility. And justice is strongest when it quietly follows the facts instead of the loudest voice in the parking lot. As I loaded another week's groceries into the bed of my pickup beneath a clear blue sky, I realized the most important victory had nothing to do with who I was or what job I held. The real victory was watching an entire community remember that every person deserves fairness from the very first conversation, because true respect is never earned by a title. It is revealed through character, protected by integrity, and remembered long after everyone has forgotten the reason they first met.